Hey everyone, welcome back to Here in Apologetics. I'm so pumped you're joining us today. Today's part 9 of my cumulative case for Christianity. The link to the full playlist is down below, but let's get started looking at the resurrection. Matthew 28:11 through 13 says, quote, "While they were going, behold, some of the guard went into the city and told the chief priests all that had taken place. And when they had assembled with the elders and taken counsel, they gave a sufficient sum of money to the soldiers and said, 'Tell people his disciples came by night and stole him away while we were asleep.'" End quote. In the previous section, I built the historical groundwork for the resurrection of Jesus. I did this by establishing a historical foundation for the resurrection based upon certain facts. The case for the resurrection is based on 1, Jesus' death on the cross, 2, the experiences of the apostles of Jesus, 3, the transformed lives of the apostles, 4, the conversion of Paul, and 5, Jesus' burial in a tomb. Many skeptics are willing to concede these facts surrounding the life and death of Jesus, but they have different theories with which they attempt to explain the facts surrounding the life and death of Jesus. Some look at this data and deny it altogether. So, do any alternative theories to the resurrection, such as the swoon theory, mythicism, a stolen body, or hallucinations, hold any merit? I don't think they do, but the ball is in your court. Let's explore. To evaluate the different theories, I will consider 2 criteria when thinking about the resurrection: explanatory power and simplicity. In this context, explanatory power relates to the number of facts the hypothesis can explain. If the hypothesis can account for all the facts, it has an advantage over those that cannot account for all the facts. If the hypothesis cannot account for certain facts, this would be a disadvantage. The second criterion is simplicity. Simplicity looks at the number of assumptions needed for the hypothesis to be true. This is often described by Occam's razor, which claims that one should not multiply entities beyond necessity. Furthermore, a simple hypothesis does not add an auxiliary hypothesis when possible. An auxiliary hypothesis is something that the hypothesis assumes to be true for the overall theory to work without sufficient evidence to assume it's true. Theories that posit explanations that are not based on known evidence will be less likely than theories that do not have to do this, all things being equal. With these tools in mind, let's now explore different theories surrounding the resurrection, or lack thereof, of Jesus. Number 1, Jesus didn't die on the cross. A popular theory offered as an alternative to the resurrection is known as the swoon theory. This theory claims that, contrary to common belief, Jesus didn't die on the cross but merely appeared to die. After his resurrection, Jesus appeared to his followers who thought that Jesus had died, so the apostles then claimed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, let's look at explanatory power. For good reason, there are not many people who take the swoon theory seriously. While the swoon theory could potentially explain the facts of the experiences of the apostles and account for Jesus' burial in a tomb, there are many areas where the theory is lacking. First, the swoon theory fails to explain how Jesus avoided death on the cross. The Romans were excellent killers, and after being nailed to a cross and pierced with a spear, it's hard to see how Jesus could have survived the cross. Furthermore, the swoon theory fails to explain why the disciples would still choose to follow Jesus after his apparent resurrection. Keep in mind that even if Jesus didn't die on the cross, he would have to have been in a near-death state after somehow surviving the crucifixion. A crucified Jesus would have been in a horrific physical state after surviving the crucifixion. The physical condition of Jesus would be a very different physical state from the idea found in the New Testament of a glorified resurrection of Jesus Christ, the Savior of the world. Furthermore, the swoon theory fails to explain the conversion of the persecutor of the church, Paul. Why would Paul worship someone who only appeared to resurrect, but appeared after his crucifixion in a near-death state? So, in terms of explanatory power, the swoon theory hypothesis can explain only 2 of the 5 relevant facts. Now, let's look at simplicity. This hypothesis also lacks simplicity. It assumes that somehow Jesus didn't die on the cross, which is not a claim supported by any early source. So the swoon theory adds on an auxiliary hypothesis, making it less simple than some of its rivals. Theory number 2, Jesus didn't exist. A different line of thought given by the skeptic is to argue that perhaps Jesus didn't exist at all. So instead of affirming facts such as the crucifixion of Jesus and his burial in a tomb, skeptics taking this move typically deny all these facts surrounding the life and death of Jesus, except for perhaps the conversion of Paul. The Jesus mythicists point to different lines of data to argue for their position, including the absence of sources surrounding Jesus, the heavy reliance on Paul, or the comparisons between Jesus and pagan deities. So let's look at the explanatory power. If we have good reason to think that the 5 claims I have brought forward about the life and death of Jesus are true, then the mythicist hypothesis would have no explanatory power. If we have good historical reason to think Jesus died on the cross, was buried in a tomb, His disciples experienced the risen Jesus and had transformed lives, and the conversion of the persecutor Paul actually happened, the mythicist hypothesis is in shambles. For these reasons, the mythicists must resort to denying these facts or retreat to unnecessarily complex interpretations to explain these facts. Here, the mythicist faces a major problem with regards to explanatory power. Now, let's look at simplicity. There are many reasons that you can count on probably only one hand the number of professional scholars in academia who are currently Jesus mythicists. There are multiple lines of evidence supporting a historical Jesus: Paul, the Gospels, and non Christian sources such as Josephus. However, many mythicists point to the correlations between Jesus and pagan deities. This claim faces the challenge of the uniqueness of Jesus. Skeptics may be able to point to other figures who supposedly rose from the dead in ancient history, but a figure who was killed as an atonement for sin for the whole world is a claim that seems to be unmatched in ancient history. The mythicist hypothesis also suffers greatly from the problem of simplicity. It adds many auxiliary hypotheses to explain the data. These include arguing that those who believed in a historical Jesus, such as Paul or the authors of the Gospels, did not report the literal truth, arguing that the New Testament authors used pagan and or other texts to create a Messiah figure, and explaining how the Christian movement exploded even if the person it is founded upon didn't exist. While Jesus mythicism cannot be disproven, the mythicist hypothesis has to rewrite much of what is commonly assumed to be true about Jesus, making it a much more complex hypothesis. Number 3, the disciples stole Jesus' body. One response to the data surrounding the life and death of Jesus is to argue that the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Perhaps the disciples were so grief stricken at the thought of their leader dying after the great hope he gave them that the disciples stole the body of Jesus and then proclaimed the resurrection. While this hypothesis can account for facts such as Jesus' death and burial in a tomb, this theory fails to account for numerous other pieces of data. If the disciples stole the body, their reported experiences of the risen Jesus, as seen in 1 Corinthians 15, would have to have been fabricated. This theory also fails to explain why the persecutor of the church, Paul, converted to Christianity. If the disciples stole the body, it seems more likely that Paul would argue that this was the case than for Paul to accept the resurrection. Furthermore, it is questionable why apostles such as Peter would be willing to suffer and die for the faith if he knew that the resurrection was a lie. People often are willing to die for things they believe are a lie, but rarely is it the case that someone is willing to suffer martyrdom for something they know is a lie. Now let's look at simplicity. The stolen body hypothesis fails to account for numerous points of data that make it a much more complex hypothesis. This hypothesis assumes that there was some sufficient reason for the apostles or someone else to steal the body of Jesus when it is questionable if there would be one. It also assumes that the disciples would be willing to suffer for the faith for something that they knew was a lie, something that I think is unlikely to occur. For these reasons, the stolen body hypothesis is not simple. Number 4, the disciples hallucinated the risen Jesus. This is perhaps the most common non-resurrection explanation for the facts surrounding the life and death of Jesus given today. A skeptic might argue that a hallucination by the apostle Peter, the 12 disciples, and or the 500 reported in 1 Corinthians 15 is responsible for the origins of the belief in the resurrection. So let's look at explanatory power. A hallucination could account for facts such as the conversion of Paul and affirm Jesus' death by crucifixion. One problem with the hallucination hypothesis is that it struggles to explain the account for Jesus' burial in a tomb. His burial in a tomb is a serious flaw in the hallucination hypothesis. From the very beginning of Christianity, see 1 Corinthians 15, the preaching of the resurrection of Jesus is central to the Christian message. However, if the disciples merely hallucinated the risen Jesus, the Jews at the time could easily show the disciples the body of Jesus, still buried in a tomb. If the body of Jesus was there, the hallucinations of the disciples of the risen Jesus could be shown to be just figments of their imagination. Another problem with the hallucination hypothesis is the question of how hallucinations could collectively lead to early Christians believing in a risen Jesus. It seems unlikely, if not impossible, that all the disciples or various other Christians had collective hallucinations that led to their belief in the resurrection. Also, typically, after a hallucination, it is recognized the event was in fact a hallucination. So the hallucination hypothesis does not adequately explain the disciples' experiences and transformed lives along with Jesus' burial in a tomb. Now, let's look at simplicity. The hallucination hypothesis must argue that either Jesus was not buried in a tomb or given an auxiliary hypothesis to explain the data of the burial in the tomb. It also assumes that the disciples, Paul, and others hallucinated the risen Jesus when there seems to be no textual evidence supporting that they did so. For this reason, the hallucination hypothesis is not a simple view because it needs to add extra explanations to account for certain historical facts, and these explanations do not have a historical backing. Number 5, Jesus rose from the dead. The resurrection of Jesus is the simplest hypothesis with the most explanatory power when looking at the case for the resurrection. This idea takes the claims of the New Testament authors at face value by just accepting the resurrection. So, when looking at explanatory power, the resurrection hypothesis can explain all five facts established in the last video: Jesus' crucifixion, burial in a tomb, the disciples' experiences, their transformed lives, and the conversion of the church persecutor Paul can all be explained by the resurrection hypothesis. Therefore, it can explain all the data and has maximal explanatory power with regards to the data considered. Now, with simplicity. Furthermore, the resurrection is a very simple hypothesis. If I am right that there is good reason to think that God exists, the resurrection hypothesis only needs an explanation for why God would have sufficient reason to want to raise Jesus from the dead. If Jesus' teachings are true, a resurrection would vindicate Jesus' teachings. Furthermore, if God created the universe, as I have argued, surely he would want to reveal himself to human beings. If God created the universe, that would raise credence to think that there would be some sort of religious revelation. If this is the case, there is good reason to think that a religiously significant miracle, like a resurrection, may have occurred or will occur in the future. For these reasons, I think there is good reason to think that God would have sufficient reason to raise Jesus from the dead. So, in this video, we've surveyed 5 different responses to the evidence offered for the resurrection of Jesus. While the different theories surrounding the facts about the life and death of Jesus offer valuable ideas worth considering, it seems to me that the best explanation of the historical facts is that Jesus rose from the dead. What does this mean for us today? That's what the final video is all about. Thanks for listening, everyone. This is here in Apologetics. The link to the full playlist is down below. It's also in this end screen. But for now, I'll catch you later. Be sure to subscribe, leave a like, and all that fun stuff. But have a good one, everyone, and God bless.